So you found an old classic, or you found an old car, and you want to get it running, and it hasn't been running in years. Well, what's involved in the process? You're going to find out right now here on Mike's Motorworx. We just said that we need to get something up and running that hasn't been running and working in years. John, if you know that certain things are good with the motor, what are some of the other things that you need to check before you try firing it up for the very first time?
First thing is fuel.
Okay.
That is one of the most important things to a four-stroke engine, and it is a four-stroke, meaning it's fire, fuel, and air. Compression does come into play also.
All right, so you got to have fuel. It's got to be the right fuel. So chances are, if it's been sitting for a while, that fuel has turned bad, and it probably has kind of like a kerosene-ish kind of smell to it.
Yeah, it smells more like a varnish.
Like a varnish, like you paint wood with.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, you'll know if you have bad fuel. It's probably been watered out, especially with the modern fuels.
Yes.
It probably has water in it. So you need to flush the entire fuel system.
Yes.
All right. So that would involve dropping the tank, running and pumping new fuel through the lines and checking for leaks. Is that correct?
What we're going to do, just because of the time frame of how long it's been there and just been sitting with a varnish, we're going to take some brake clean and actually force brake clean all the way through from the tank all the way up to the throttle body. So we're basically going to disassemble all the lines from the fuel tank, fuel pump, all the way to the throttle body, and actually force brake clean through that with compressed air to get all that varnish out.
And this application is injected, so that means there is a fuel pump involved as opposed to an electronic fuel pump somewhere, as opposed to a mechanical fuel pump on the engine. All right.
It's a low pressure pump. It only requires about 35 PSI for these two injectors.
All right. So there's just two injectors. Is there anything you got to worry about with the injector side of this?
Yes, but generally on these particular injectors, they're pretty stout. They can handle a lot of water, varnish, fuels. It can handle quite a bit. So the injectors themselves should be okay, but we will be rebuilding them whenever we determine how bad the motor is.
All right, but if somebody else has, say, like a not direct injection, but a multi-port injection or what have you, they need to definitely check.
Yes. Now, the 350 of the multi-port injection, they have a spider assembly, and those are notorious for issues. If it's been sitting for any period of time, I would replace them.
Good deal. And this is a 1990 K1500 with a 350 that we're working on today. So you'll have to know your particular application. All right, so after you ensure that there is definitely fuel going through there, you need to check spark plugs?
Yep.
Okay, check spark plugs, and then checking to make sure that you got the ignition system is actually working. You do that by simply grounding out the spark plug and check for spark?
Well, there's multiple ways to do it. We're actually use a timing light.
Okay.
Is for us the most efficient, just because you're hooking straight to battery and to the #1 spark plug, and you fire it over a couple times, and that tells you whether your distributor and your coil's actually doing its job. Whether the spark's getting to the spark plug, we'll have to do it a different way to determine that.
Good deal. Now, if somebody doesn't they got the fuel, they've got the spark, all right, and they run into the problem where it's still not firing up, the next thing is to check is compression. So you would actually need to get a compression tester tied into each individual spark plug.
You would pull all 8 spark plugs in this case, and that way you get a more accurate reading when it comes to the compression. Compression is very important, so that's why you want to pull all 8 spark plugs and test one at a time with at least 5 revolutions. And
is there a certain amount of pressure that they're looking for, or is that going to vary based off the engine?
It's all going to vary off of engine. The best thing to do is check with the manufacturer. Generally, we recommend at our shop between 125 and 170 is ideal.
Ideal for your general applications, but specific ones are going to be different. So you definitely want to look that up and get the information from there. So Is there anything else we need to cover before we start diving in and checking fuel?
Nope, just the big thing is safety. That's obviously very important. We are still dealing with fuels and it can still ignite. So use common sense out there, be smart, always have the necessary equipment to be safe.
Exactly. So fire extinguishers nearby. Don't be smoking. Don't be lighting sparks.
Yes.
That kind of thing, because you are dealing with fuel and fuel vapors in this case. And you could easily do this in your driveway if you don't have access to a lift, but we just happen to be blessed with a lift here.
Yes.
All righty. Good deal. Let's see what pulling the fuel system and cleaning it out looks like. All right, Johnny, so we already have the air cleaner off, and again, we're dealing with a Chevy 350. Is this going to be similar to other Chevrolet models in this year, in this era?
Yes, this is still considered one of the first earlier model throttle body injected. So this is still kind of a younger style setup.
All right, so what have we done and what are we looking for?
All right, so we've already taken the air filter and the air filter box off. This right here, these two right here are the actual injectors.
Okay.
So that is what actually injects the fuel into the intake and into the cylinders. There's two lines on the back side. I've already disconnected them yesterday just so I could see how bad the fuel lines are. As far as the smell of the fuel, and they are rough. I mean, it smells somewhat like it's been sitting for about 5 years. So it is heavily varnished. It is still combustible, but we've disconnected the lines. There's one there on the return, and the second is the feed over here. And that's real simple. The fittings is standard nut and flare fittings. So that's pretty easy to undo. So make sure you get those lines undone so that way when we put the cleaner through the fuel system, it'll be safe for the injectors.
Good deal. So now we're at a point where we can go ahead and get the vehicle in the air. You could drop the tank and you could start trying to flush out the system. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So John, we're underneath here, and this is something that came from the factory, but it's specific for this particular model. This is a skid plate for the fuel tank, is that correct?
Yes.
So obviously the skid plate's got to come off.
Yes.
Well, what happens after the skid plate comes off to drop the tank?
Well, on some vehicles, the skid plate actually attaches and holds the fuel tank itself. But on the GMs, they are separate. This is an add-on, but it is a factory add-on. Some applications didn't offer this. More specifically, the lower end K5 Blazers and Jimmys, but most of the four-wheel drives come with a skid plate. It was pretty much came standard, but this is a very heavy piece.
Looks like an 1/8-inch steel essentially plate that's been custom fabbed just for this application.
Just for this. There's actually 6 bolts holding this in place, and they are larger bolts. So this thing does weigh quite a bit. So use jacks, jack stands, whatever it takes. Do not get underneath of this thing and let it fall on you. So we'll actually be using a transmission jack to take this all the way down.
Now, before you said that this, on some models, this skid plate is actually attached to the tank. In that case, you're pulling everything down with one assembly.
One assembly.
So what would you do for those applications?
Definitely you got to have a jack just because these are the steel gas tanks themselves are still steel, unlike the new stuff that are plastic. All this is 100% steel. So those that have the strap part of the skid plate is going to be dropped all in one assembly, but this one is separate. All
right, now somebody's going to ask, all right, you know, obviously you got to make sure how much fuel is in there, that kind of thing. You know, but how do you make sure that, hey, don't have a full tank of fuel in there? What do you do? If you do, is there a way to drain it? What happens?
There's 2 ways to do it. One, the fuel filler inlet on the side. You disconnect that rubber hose and take a siphon and just siphon all the fuel out. You can get a external fuel pump. Is one way to do it. That's the easiest and most common. Is just to take a inline fuel pump, 12 volt, hook it to your battery, and just suck all the fuel out of it. If you got a siphon, use a siphon. But you want to try and get as much fuel out of it as possible, unless you've got a specific jack designed for transmissions and fuel tanks. Then it's not as big of a deal, but you still want to get it below 1/4 of a tank. This is a 30+ gallon tank. So if it says a quarter of a tank, you can do the math. You know how much fuel's in it. So keep that in mind. You want as little fuel in it as possible if you're doing it at home without a jack.
And if I remember right, every gallon of fuel is about 8.8 pounds, almost 9 pounds. So you can just round up 9 times however many gallons of fuel, and boom, there you go. So you got 5 gallons of fuel. That's 45 additional pounds that you got inside of the tank itself.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so we're going to put this thing into fast motion and let you guys see how that's done on this particular application.
Okay, so we did have to take the trailer hitch out, and there is a plate along the top. Some of them are rubber, some of them are metal. This one's the metal. There's 4 bolts that hold a tin in place. You just gotta move that out of the way. But there's actually a nut on the bottom and on the top. So just make sure you get that top plate out of the way and loosen those nuts, and make sure you got something supporting the gas tank.
All right, Johnny, with the fuel pump being replaced in the fuel tank, what do we need to look at next as far as an injected engine or maybe even a carbureted engine is concerned, as far as clearing the fuel lines, making sure there's good flow?
Well, first thing is to get the old fuel filter out.
Okay.
We want to replace that filter, get rid of any kind of contaminants, make sure that's in good shape. So we'll pull the fuel filter out, put a new one in. Then we're going to take some brake clean and clean out the lines. We're going to put a little bit of compressed air through there, just to help clean and get all that basically varnished fuel out of the system.
So basically you're doing that for the main line and the return line, is that correct?
Both lines, that way you get it all clean system.
Good deal, so you're going with a clean system. Now, when you put the fuel tank back in, okay, what's it going to take for everything to be primed up? Will it prime by itself? Is it going to take a couple turns? Will the fuel pump do it by itself? What'll happen?
On these particular ones, because they're an electric fuel pump, you're really going to be cycling the key multiple times to get some of that fuel out. You can crack the line on the throttle body or carburetor and prime it a couple times by cycling the key. But ideally, the best thing to do is keep everything hooked up, and it'll actually clear itself just by cycling the key. On the older styles with a mechanical pump, generally what you want to do is try and kind of pull a little bit of a vacuum to get that fuel pump primed itself, and then hook it up to the carburetor, and then start the engine a couple of times.
Good deal. Now on this particular vehicle, all right, you're expecting that once the fuel is in there, it should fire up, but
it should.
It should.
If everything, and from what the previous owner said, it just sat. It did have a tune-up done before he quit driving it.
All right, so we're expecting good spark. We're expecting things like that. So hopefully all will work out. But we mentioned before that in the event it doesn't work, you're going to need to check for a spark. You're going to need to check the distributor if it has one.
Yes.
And you're going to need to check those other items, replace your plugs, replace your wires, things like that.
Absolutely.
Good deal. And we are expecting a little bit of noise on the lower side.
Yes, we are. He said it did have a lower end knock, which means either a bearing or a wrist pin could be bad, which I kind of suspect to be pretty accurate. The previous owner did pretty well take care of his stuff. I mean, you see from the undercarriage, it is in really, really good shape. The frame is nice, clean, very, very little rust. A lot of caking from basically time and use.
Right.
So
a lot of sand.
A lot of sand. But we live, there's a lot of dirt roads where we're at, so it's kind of to be expected.
All right. We'll put everything in time lapse and let you, we'll come back after all is said and done to see if that was indeed the problem or if there are more steps.
Absolutely.
There is no illusion here at Mike's Motorworx, so this is a different day. Now, when we left off, I saw us squirting some brake cleaner and such through the fuel lines to clear them up. Did we get fuel to the vehicle that day?
Not that day. We were fighting electrical gremlins. This thing has been sitting, so we were fighting ground and power issues. So we finally got the grounds and all the electrical issues straightened out.
Good deal. So we are now connected everywhere, is that correct?
That's correct.
So everything that we undid, we connected. Now, is there any final checks like oil or anything else that you should do before you try to fire this thing up for the first time?
Yes, always check your oil. Make sure it has good oil in it, and at least within the hash marks or dots for your vehicle application.
Now, if a person wanted to, could they take some carb cleaner or brake cleaner, fire it straight into the throttle body to see if it'll fire?
Absolutely. The best thing to use is ether. You don't want to use a whole lot, just a small amount just to get that initial start. You can use carburetor cleaner, you can use brake clean. It's not great to use brake clean on the newer engines because it's got a film on there, and that brake clean can actually take that film away.
So off of like the map sensor and all that good stuff, right?
Right, well, it's more than that. When you're going straight into the throttle body, that throttle body has a very thin coating on there that helps with airflow. So you got to be real careful with certain throttle bodies, and some valves have a coating over top of it.
Fair enough. Alrighty. So what else do we need to check for before we fire this guy up?
Cycle the key about 20 times. Cycle it 5 or 6 times. Look, make sure you don't have any fuel leaking out anywhere. Make sure everything is good. You don't want to see any kind of fuel leaking or anything like that. So cycle the key multiple times to get the electric pump primed. It'll actually get rid of the air on its own. And
you're talking cycling not in the sense of turning it to starting it to turn it over, but cycling it to the on position?
To the on position, what we call key on, engine off.
All right.
So it goes all the way to the run position, not start. And you're going to cycle that to the run position several times.
Good deal. All right, is there anything else we need to do before we try to fire this thing up the first time?
Nope, I've already cycled the key multiple times. We do know we're getting good fuel flow through the lines, so we're ready to start.
All right, any last minute safety checks that need to be aware of? Make sure it doesn't move while in park, that kind of thing?
No, generally, unless you're running a standard transmission, but here in the shop, it's still attached to the lift, so I'm not too concerned with that. It is in park. It is always a good idea if it's been sitting to make sure your park brake's on, but your park pole is actually what's going to stop it in an automatic transmission.
Fair enough. All right, let's give this a shot and see what's going on.
All right, we ready?
We're ready.
Yeah.
Only a minor vibration at start.
Very little. Starting to hear just a little bit of a tap.
Belts and all aren't squeaking.
Yeah, belts look good.
There we go. Wow. Easy as that. All right, John, for road and reliability, what is the next series of steps for an old classic car?
Well, the next step is distributor. If your vehicle, after you know it's getting fuel and it still doesn't actually physically run, or it starts and then dies immediately after within a few seconds, check the distributor. On some of these OBD1 systems, there's a plug on particularly these Jimmys and K5 Blazers and the Silverados, or the K5 or K1500s and C1500s. There's a wire for the distributor timing. I don't know if you can see this. This little plug right here. And what this does is you disconnect this plug and it actually changes and gets rid of the spark advanced. So it goes back to old school, straight up, straight timing.
Okay.
And that'll tell you if you have a problem with the internals of the distributor.
Alrighty, cool. Awesome, that looks great. So just check that. Anything else needs to be checked out, Johnny?
Make sure you got good oil pressure. Ours is running good oil pressure. It's right around 55 PSI. So we know we're getting good oil pressure. We went ahead and did an oil change while we had it up just to be on the safe side.
Right.
So we put new fresh oil in there and a good filter. We went ahead and topped off the transfer case and did a transmission service.
Good deal. So next step would be checking out for road reliability, such as stopping,
Yes.
acceleration, how your tires are holding up, balancing,
Yes.
all that kind of good stuff.
Keep in mind your tires, your DOT's dates. Make sure they're not too old. If they are, replace them just as a safety. These are really starting to dry rot. He did put these on before it sat, but that was 4+ years ago.
Okay.
So we are going to need to do new tires.
Yeah, I saw some cracks in those tires. That
Yeah,
were sitting out there.
they're starting to crack up. We haven't pulled the tires off yet, or the wheels off yet to inspect the brakes. That will be coming. This Jimmy, he actually added manual locking hubs.
Oh.
So with this system, it's a little bit more difficult to do brakes on this, which we will actually show you at a later episode.
Sweet.
But the next step would be checking your lights. Make sure all your lights are working, your tag lights, your stop lights, tail lights, turn signals, headlights, high beams, wipers. Make sure your wipers work. So just basic safety stuff now, and make sure everything is legal.
All right. So we're on to the next steps. Is that all for this episode, you think?
I think so.
All right.
Catch you on the next episode.